As we deal with ever-increasing loneliness in our community 365 days of the year, how do we solve the idea of loneliness at Christmas? Well, Ros Thomas is a recipient of the Churchill Fellowship and has made it their mission to fight loneliness during Christmas time. Ros, hello to you.
Hello, Paul.
Why is this a passion for you?
I think academics have coined the term the lonely paradox to describe how severe isolation and loneliness has become much of a silent epidemic worldwide, despite the fact that we're more digitally connected than ever. And I saw this for myself when I gave up writing a newspaper column for 5 years to become the sole carer for my mum, who'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And I became sort of critically aware of the often invisible world inhabited by carers and the elderly. And I was already writing a novel that had a centre an elderly cut off from his family. And so I sort of ended up in this predicament where I was almost circling, the subject of loneliness, not only in real life, but also in my imagination, writing a novel. And so I became really quite interested in the research, and it was sending me down rabbit holes at which I'd discovered that Australia was well behind the rest of the world in interventions and pilot projects that were, hoping to reconnect the chronically lonely to their community. And so I decided that I'd have a crack at a Churchill Fellowship to see if they would be interested in sponsoring some academic research from Australia. And I think I'm become very lucky to have landed one.
And really what a wonderful cause to be researching. How are you doing this?
Well, the really interesting thing about chronic loneliness, and that is loneliness as a clinical condition, is that it really doesn't discriminate. It's at record levels amongst single young men, amongst middle-aged divorced men, amongst carers, the bereaved, and of course the elderly, which we're aware of that, but especially women. And the latest census tells us that 1 in 5 Australians was living alone. 8 years ago, it was only about 17%. So academics have begun to ask why the exponential rise, because the pandemic was, of course, partly to blame. But I wanted to investigate the research coming out of countries like the UK, where the British government has deemed loneliness such an enormous public health crisis that they've appointed a minister for loneliness.
So just for people that maybe aren't familiar, when you're lonely and when you're experiencing chronic loneliness, what is that impact? What does that do for your health, for your well-being, for your outlook?
Well, we now know that experiencing severe loneliness is usually a long-term condition, and it's a state of profound distress. The body understands loneliness as an emergency, so it raises levels of the stress hormone cortisol in our blood, which then leads to a rise in heart rate and blood pressure, poor sleep patterns, cognitive decline. And of course, there's also a social stigma attached to admitting that you're lonely. Saying, I'm lonely equates to almost saying I'm unlovable or nobody likes me. So people who are lonely are themselves so horrified by what they're experiencing that they become secretive and self-obsessed. But in the US, the Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, has declared that chronic loneliness is the next pandemic for America and is as bad for your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day or being morbidly obese. So, other countries are considering that chronic loneliness is very much a public health emergency.
Ros, can I ask a question that might sound a bit strange? Can you be surrounded by people and still feel lonely?
Oh, of course. I mean, some of the worst cases of loneliness that I've been interviewing are people who are in marriages where the marriage is in decline and one party or both parties are feeling intensely lonely. And of course, you can be incredibly lonely in social situations. We all know that. Loneliness is very much about the amount of need for social contact and social contact. And not everybody's need for social contact is the same, of course. That's why we have introverts and extroverts. But when those needs are not met, then you have the conditions and the factors present that can cause loneliness. And when that condition becomes chronic is when you end up with, a serious health condition. And, incredibly, cognitive decline is rapidly sped up by severe loneliness. And most of your listeners will probably know somebody who has been alone for so long that they are in a state of cognitive decline, and that is really scary because our figures for Alzheimer's and dementia are on a rapid trajectory on the up.
Ros Thomas is your guest this afternoon here on ABC Newcastle, a Churchill Fellowship recipient looking specifically attempting to solve loneliness at Christmas. Why is it, Ros, do you think? What do we know about what makes the Christmas time such an acute period for loneliness?
Oh, I think that's for everybody. Christmas is a stressful time, even in good stress. Good stress, I mean, as in, it's busy and, there's a lot of things to organise. But also families are brought together at Christmas because there is an expectation that you should spend Christmas with your family. Not all families get along, so there's stress associated with that. If you are missing from your family or your children are overseas or you're recently divorced or you've recently lost a partner, then obviously those factors are brought into sharp relief when it appears that everybody else is having a wonderful time with family and you are very much alone or isolated. So I don't think it takes a brain, it's not hard to understand why Christmas is such a difficult time for a lot of people. But I think Christmas time is often a short period of intense stress, whereas what I'm studying is chronic isolation, severe loneliness on a long-term basis that's not fixed by going back to work in January or not fixed by, leaving the family home where you've just had a fight with your brother or your sister. So, long-term clinical condition of severe loneliness is another step up in terms of the number of presentations to emergency that people who are chronically lonely often don't talk to their GP about how they're feeling because they're embarrassed and they're ashamed of having to admit to it. So often when, their cardiovascular issues or their cognitive issues become so severe, they bypass the GP and present straight to emergency. So that's why it's really hard to identify people who are lonely in the community, and it's even harder to work out what interventions might work best for them.
Ros, if someone's listening right now and thinking, yeah, I think that might be me, do you have advice for them?
Well, it's really interesting. Since I was awarded a Churchill Fellowship, Obviously, I'm not travelling, so the Churchill Fellowship is a period of time up to 3 months spent investigating global best practice around the world. So mid-next year, I'll travel around the world looking at which countries are doing what for severe loneliness. But in the meantime, I've already launched, the Loneliness Project in Australia to try and get an idea of whether we can start talking about this in an effort to try and make people understand that it's okay to admit to loneliness, much in the same way as we started talking about mental illness and mental health 10 years ago, and now it's very much a conversation that no one's afraid of having. I'm hoping to do the same thing for loneliness. But what I was intending on doing, being a journalist, an investigative journalist for many, many years in television, radio and newspapers, was I wanted to talk to people, to interview people who might be prepared to admit to their loneliness and to talk to them about the circumstances that led to them being isolated, because I think that's what you need to hear when you're worried about whether you're feeling that loneliness yourself, is you need to know that you're not alone. You need to know that loneliness doesn't discriminate and that there are people all around you who might secretly be feeling the same way. So I've been conducting a series of interviews that are being published online, one about once a fortnight, and also asking people to sit for a photographic portrait. I'm a photographer. And it's been fascinating to hear the stories of how people ended up isolated from their social networks or how they became estranged from family. That's been really fascinating, and I think that's giving people in the community a great sense of, oh, I'm not alone. And I think part of the process of coming out of that state of chronic loneliness is understanding that you are not alone, that we have all experienced loneliness to some degree, and in actual fact, it's the universal human experience.
Yeah, how extraordinary. Ros, good luck with your research. Thank you for sharing your knowledge of it thus far, and you'll have to come back when you've done more of the work.
Oh, I will. Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Ros Thomas, Churchill Fellowship recipient, looking at loneliness, as you've been hearing there. Here on ABC Newcastle, you'll find out what the weather's doing